Welcome back to Visionaries of War, the channel that uncovers the hidden architects of our modern military. We see the weapons that define the battlefield, the stealth bomber, the precision missile, the networked soldier, and we assume they were born from a linear, logical process. We assume they were commissioned by generals, designed by committees, and built by massive corporations. But the history of technology is rarely that clean. Often, the most revolutionary, game-changing ideas come from a single, obsessive mind. A mind that sees the world differently, a mind that rejects the impossible and chases a vision so radical it's deemed absurd. Tonight we tell the story of one such man, an inventor, an engineer, a man who lived and breathed aerodynamics, who was haunted by a single, perfect shape. He sketched a design for a warplane that seemed to defy the very laws of flight. It had no tail, no distinct fuselage. It was just a wing. His colleagues, the titans of the industry, the senior officers who signed the checks, called his idea a fantasy. They called him a crank, a crazy inventor. They insisted, with all the weight of their proven expertise, that his machine was an aerodynamic death trap that should never have flown. But that rejected design, that crazy idea, would be built, and it would fail. And it would be forgotten, only to re-emerge decades later, its core principles finally unlocked by new technology, becoming the very foundation of America's most terrifying and dominant aerial weapon. This is the crazy inventor who designed a warplane that should never have flown. Before we open the hangar doors on this incredible story, if you believe that true genius often lies in the ideas that are dismissed, and that these unsung visionaries deserve their moment in the light, I need you to join our squadron. First, hit that subscribe button and make sure you ring the notification bell. It's the only way to ensure you get these declassified reports. Second, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this history matters and needs to be seen. And finally, drop a comment down below. Let us know what country and city you're watching from. It's always incredible to see our global command center light up. All right, pull the chocks. Let's get this story airborne. In the late 1930s, the world of aviation was defined by a specific, universally accepted shape, a long, cylindrical fuselage, a set of wings mounted in the middle, and, crucially, a tail assembly at the back. The tail, with its vertical and horizontal stabilizers, was the bedrock of aeronautical design, the accepted, immutable solution to the fundamental problems of stability and control. It was the rudder that kept the plane flying straight, the elevator that kept it level. To suggest removing it wasn't just radical. It was tantamount to suggesting a car didn't need a steering wheel. It was, in the eyes of the established engineering world, sheer, unadulterated madness. And in that world of established conservative genius, Alistair Vance was the resident madman. He wasn't wild-eyed or eccentric in person. On the surface, Vance was a quiet, meticulous, almost shy engineer, a man who spoke in the precise language of mathematics and airflow diagrams, but beneath that mild exterior burned an obsession, a white-hot, decades-long conviction that the entire premise of aircraft design was wrong. He was the founder, chief engineer, and spiritual leader of Vance Aircraft, a small but respected company that survived by building reliable, conventional, if uninspired, training and transport planes for the Army Air Corps. But his official work was just a means to an end. His true passion, the thing that consumed his nights and his private research budget, was the all-wing aircraft. Vance was haunted by an idea of perfect efficiency. He looked at a conventional airplane, at a B-17 Flying Fortress or a Douglas DC-3, and he didn't see a marvel of engineering. He saw waste. He saw a long, heavy tube, the fuselage, and a complex set of tail surfaces that did nothing to generate lift, yet contributed enormously to the two great enemies of flight, weight and parasitic drag. The fuselage and tail were dead weight, baggage the wings were forced to carry, baggage that demanded bigger engines, more fuel, and resulted in slower speeds and shorter ranges. Vance's vision, sketched in 1,000 notebooks, modeled in countless balsa wood gliders, was to eliminate this waste entirely. His plane would be just a wing, a pure, clean, elegant lifting surface. The crew, the engines, the fuel, the payload, all of it would be contained inside the thick, broad-cored wing. In his calculations, the payoff was revolutionary. By eliminating the parasitic drag of the fuselage and tail, his flying wing would, for the same amount of power, fly 20% faster, 25% further, and carry a significantly heavier load than any conventional aircraft of the same size. It was the logical mathematical endpoint of aerodynamic efficiency. It was, in his mind, the perfect airplane. There was, of course, the problem that all the other sane engineers pointed to: stability. Without the long lever arm of a fuselage and the correcting force of a tail, how would the wing keep itself from tumbling out of the sky? A conventional plane is like an arrow. The fins, the tail, keep it pointed forward. Vance's design was more like a discus, inherently wanting to spin and tumble. The problem of yaw stability, keeping the nose pointed straight, was the great unsolved riddle of the all-wing design. The slightest crosswind, or the failure of an engine on one side, would theoretically cause the wing to slew sideways, lose lift, and enter an unrecoverable flat spin. This was the death trap his rivals and the military procurement officers always pointed to. This was the reason his proposals, submitted with meticulous, beautiful data from his own private wind tunnel, were consistently, and often condescendingly, rejected. "Alistair, it's a beautiful drawing," a senior general at Wright Field had told him in 1940. "It's a wonderful academic exercise, but it's not a warplane. It's an uncontrollable kite. We are in the business of building flying fortresses, not flying pancakes. Your design, it just shouldn't fly." The laughter in that briefing room, the polite dismissive chuckles from men who were building the B-29 superfortress, a plane Vance secretly regarded as a triumph of brute force over elegant design, was a humiliation he would never forget. He was called a visionary in magazines, a crank in the boardrooms. But the looming shadow of World War II gave his obsession a new, desperate urgency. He knew his flying wing wasn't just efficient. It was the perfect bomber. A conventional long-range bomber like the B-29 was a massive target, bristling with gun turrets to defend itself. Vance's wing, presenting a tiny frontal cross-section and a confusing, tailless silhouette, would be inherently harder to see, harder to track, harder to hit, and its efficiency meant it could fly higher and faster, potentially above the reach of enemy fighters and flak. While the war raged, and while his official company churned out components for B-24s and P-38s, unofficially, in a locked, guarded section of his Burbank factory, Alistair Vance was committing an act of industrial treason. He was pouring his company's wartime profits and his own personal fortune into the secret construction of his dream. He was building his crazy plane, the one that should never fly, right under the government's nose. He had gathered a small, fanatically loyal team of engineers and mechanics, men who believed in the old man's vision with a quasi-religious fervor. They called themselves the Wingnuts. They worked nights, weekends, scrounging materials, handcrafting components, solving 1,000 impossible problems in secret. How do you control yaw? Vance's solution was to invent elevons, control surfaces on the trailing edge of the wing that combined the function of elevators and ailerons, coupled with massive split-surface clamshell rudders that would open up at the wingtips to create drag, allowing the plane to be steered like a sled. How do you manage asymmetric thrust from the 4 massive Pratt & Whitney Wasp major propeller engines? Complex interconnected throttle controls, all managed by the pilot. It was an aerodynamic nightmare, a web of complex mechanical linkages, all designed to give the pilot a chance at taming the inherent, brutal instability of the design. By late 1944, with the war in Europe reaching its climax and the B-29s beginning their fiery campaign against Japan, Vance's secret was ready. He hadn't just built a model, he had built a monster. It was the N9M, a 1/3 scale test bed, but still a large, crude aircraft with a 60-foot wingspan. It was a bizarre, beautiful, terrifying machine. A bright yellow and blue boomerang that looked like something out of a science fiction serial. It was the first critical step. The flight tests were harrowing. The N9M was, as predicted, a beast. It was twitchy, unstable, demanding constant, exhausting input from the test pilots. One of the prototypes entered an unrecoverable spin. killing the pilot and cementing the death trap reputation of Vance's design. The experts in the Army Air Forces shook their heads, their suspicions confirmed. It was unstable. It was a failure. They told him for the second time to abandon the project. But Vance was undeterred. The crash wasn't a failure of the concept, he argued. It was a failure of the control system. They just needed more power, more authority. He convinced the AAF in the dying days of the war to fund one last massive gamble. He wouldn't just build a testbed. He would build the bomber, the plane he had always dreamed of, the YB-35. It was a behemoth, a colossal flying wing with a 172-foot wingspan, powered by 4 massive Wasp major engines driving 8 contra-rotating pusher propellers. It was designed to fly 10 Aruzuran miles, carry 40 Aruzuran pounds of bombs, and fly at 40 Aruzuran feet. It was a strategic bomber that would make the B-29 obsolete. It was, in Vance's eyes, the perfect weapon for the new, dawning Cold War. But as the prototypes were being built, as the propellers were being mounted, Vance himself had a sudden, wrenching realization. The technology was already changing. Propellers, even contra-rotating ones, were the past. The future, as the Germans had just proven with their Me-262, was the jet. And the jet engine, with its simplicity and incredible thirst for air, was a perfect match for his clean, efficient, low-drag wing. In a decision that must have seemed like madness to his backers, Vance proposed a change mid-production. Scrap the complex propeller gearboxes. Replace the 4 Wasp majors with 8 of the new Allison J-35 turbojet engines. The YB-35 became the YB-49. The transformation was breathtaking. The clean lines of the wing, once cluttered with the massive propeller assemblies, were now sleek, pure, punctuated only by the 8 smoking jet exhausts. It looked less like a plane and more like a spaceship, a black chevron that had fallen from the future. It was, in 1947, the most advanced, most radical, and most frightening aircraft on Earth. And the men who had to fly it, the hardened test pilots at Muroc Army Airfield, looked at the tailless, alien shape, looked at the complete lack of a conventional rudder, and they knew in their bones that Alistair Vance, the crazy inventor, had finally built a warplane that should never have flown. The YB-49 was a creature of the desert, an alien thing of black metal and shadows, parked on the endless, cracked mud expanse of Muroc Army Airfield in the October of 1947. To the pilots tasked with flying it, men who had cut their teeth on P-38s and B-25s, it wasn't just a new plane. It was an affront to God, a violation of the very laws of flight they had built their lives upon. It was 172 feet of nothing but wing, with a small blistered canopy for the crew, and 8 turbojet engines buried inside its massive 4-foot-thick center section. There was no tail, no rudder, no fuselage to speak of. Just a single, graceful, terrifyingly simple black boomerang. Alistair Vance, the crazy inventor, was a constant presence, a nervous bird-like man in a rumpled suit, clutching blueprints, his eyes shining with a frantic, messianic zeal. He would explain his control system to the flight crew, men led by the legendary Major Glenn Bud Edwards, a man who combined a test pilot's courage with an engineer's skeptical mind. Vance would point to his diagrams, his voice trembling with excitement. "You see, Major," he'd explain, "conventional rudders are obsolete, a source of drag. We achieve yaw control here," pointing to the trailing edge, "with these elevons, and, most critically, these clamshell split-surface rudders at the wingtips. They open like a clamshell, create precise drag, and steer the aircraft. It's aerodynamically pure. It's perfect." Edwards would just chew on his unlit cigar, his gaze fixed on the black monster waiting on the tarmac. "Alistair," he'd say, his voice a low, gravelly drawl, "this is all fine on paper. But you're telling me that if I lose an engine on the left side, with all that asymmetric thrust trying to spin me into the ground, I'm supposed to steer out of it by opening a little door on the right wingtip? You're asking me to steer a 100-ton freight train by dragging my boot in the gravel." Vance would insist the math was sound, that the control authority was sufficient. The pilots, to a man, were unconvinced. They were being asked to fly a concept, a theory, a pancake, and as they derisively called it, and they knew in their bones that it was a death trap. The first flight, on October 21st, 1947, was a moment that seared itself into the memory of everyone present. The sound, first of all. Not the familiar staccato thunder of 4 Wasp major piston engines from the YB-35, but the alien, high-pitched, continuous shriek of 8 Allison J-35 turbojets, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the desert air. The YB-49, trailing 8 plumes of black, oily smoke, lumbered down the dry lake bed, fighting for speed. It lifted off, sluggish, heavy, and immediately began to hunt. The instability was not a theoretical problem. It was an immediate, violent, physical reality. The aircraft, lacking a vertical tail to keep it aligned, began to oscillate, its nose wagging left and right in a sickening, uncontrollable Dutch roll. Inside the cramped cockpit, Major Edwards and his co-pilot, Captain Daniels, were fighting for their lives from the second they left the ground. They weren't flying the YB-49. They were taming it. They were in a constant, frantic, exhausting dance on the rudder pedals, which controlled the clamshell drag rudders, making hundreds of tiny, rapid, desperate corrections every second, just to keep the black wing pointed vaguely forward. It was like trying to balance a marble on a dinner plate in the middle of an earthquake. The plane wanted to tumble. Its natural, inherent state was to spin out of control, and only the pilot's superhuman, constant, exhaustive efforts were keeping it in the sky. Yet, it flew, and it was revolutionary. Once they got it to 40 Zorzeren feet into the thin, cold air, the YB-49 showed the promise that had driven Vance for decades. The efficiency was breathtaking. The low-drag all-wing design, now coupled with pure jet propulsion, meant it could cruise at speeds and altitudes the conventional bulky B-36 Peacemaker, its main rival, could only dream of. It was fast, it was sleek, and, as radar tests confirmed, its tiny frontal cross-section made it astonishingly difficult to detect. From the ground it was silent, a black chevron-shaped ghost sliding overhead, often unseen until it was already gone. Vance was vindicated. His crazy idea worked. Newsreels touted the bomber of the future. The Air Force, desperate for a strategic bomber that could reach the Soviet Union from bases in the U.S., started to believe. Maybe the flying pancake wasn't so crazy after all. But the pilots, the men who actually had to strap themselves into the machine, knew the truth. They came back from every flight drenched in sweat, their legs aching, their nerves shredded. "She's a witch," Edwards reported to the brass, his face grim. "She'll fly like an angel as long as everything is perfect. But she's got no forgiveness. None. She doesn't want to fly straight. You relax for 1 second, you sneeze, you hit a rough patch of air, and she'll try to kill you." The instability was a fatal flaw, a serpent coiled in the heart of Vance's paradise. The clamshell drag rudders, his great innovation, were the problem. They were crude, slow to respond, and, most terrifyingly, they increased drag. To correct a yaw to the left, the pilot had to deploy the right drag rudder, which steered the plane. Yes, but also acted as an air brake on that side, trying to slow the plane down, introducing a host of secondary, complex, and dangerous aerodynamic effects. It was a constant, exhausting battle against the plane's own nature. The graybeards in the air staff, the proponents of the conventional B-36, seized on these pilot reports. The YB-49 was too radical, too dangerous, too unstable. It was a widowmaker. Vance, desperate to prove them wrong, to prove his masterpiece was safe and controllable, pushed for more tests, more aggressive maneuvers, to demonstrate the plane's full capabilities. He needed to show it could be a stable bombing platform, that it could handle the stresses of real-world operations. And that desperation, that need to finally silence the laughter, led directly to disaster. On June 5, 1948, Major Bud Edwards, along with his co-pilot Captain Daniels and 3 other crew members, took the second YB-49 prototype, tail number 42102367, up for a high-altitude performance test. Vance was on the ground, in the radio shack at Merak, listening in, as he always did. The flight was routine, the air clear, the sky a perfect, boundless blue. Edwards was pushing the plane, testing its stall characteristics, a dangerous but necessary maneuver to understand the wing's limits. The radio transmissions were calm, clinical, just pilots and engineers talking numbers. "Okay, Alistair," Edwards' voice crackled distant. "We're at 40. Horizontal. Bringing her back, easing the nose up, airspeed bleeding off. 150 knots? 145. She's starting to buff it. A little wing wag. Standard stall warning. A pause. Then a different tone. Tense. Yaw is sloppy. Real sloppy. She's trying to slew right." Daniel's voice sharper. "Bud, I can't hold her. Full left rudder. She's not responding. She's departing." Then Edwards' final, terrifying, strained transmission. She's spinning. We're in a flat spin. Oh, God." The radio went dead, replaced by the deafening, soul-crushing hiss of static. Alistair Vance stood frozen in the radio shack, the microphone clutched in his white-knuckled hand. He knew with a sickening, cold certainty what had happened. The YB-49, lacking a tail, lacking a conventional rudder to provide a restoring force, had entered a flat spin. The clamshell rudders were useless, blanketed in stalled air, powerless to stop the rotation. The plane, the 100-ton, black, beautiful wing, was tumbling end over end, a giant broken boomerang, falling out of the sky. The crash was total. The YB-49 disintegrated in midair, the catastrophic G-forces of the uncontrollable tumble ripping the massive wing to pieces. Major Edwards and his entire crew were killed instantly. The crazy inventor's dream had become a nightmare. The men who had mocked him, who had warned him, the men who had said it should never have flown, had been proven, in the most brutal, tragic, and undeniable way possible, to be absolutely, horrifyingly right. The YB-49 project was dead. Alistair Vance was a pariah, a broken man, his perfect airplane not just a failure but the tomb of his friends. The crash of the YB-49 on June 5, 1948 was not just a tragedy, it was a verdict. It was the explosive, undeniable full-stop punctuation mark at the end of Alistair Vance's radical sentence. The smoking crater in the Mojave Desert, where Major Bud Edwards and his crew had been scattered across a square mile of scrubland, was a tomb not only for 5 brave men, but for the entire concept of the all-wing bomber. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of grim activity. Recovery teams, stunned engineers, and tight-lipped Air Force brass descended on the impact site. The investigation was swift, brutal, and, in the eyes of many, predetermined. The graybeards in the Air Force hierarchy, the men who had always distrusted Vance's flying pancake, the men who had powerful political and industrial ties to the conventional B-36 Peacemaker program, now had the irrefutable evidence they needed. The YB-49 was, as they had always suspected, a death trap. Alistair Vance, hollow-eyed, gaunt, and visibly shattered by the deaths of men he considered friends, tried to argue. He pleaded with the Accident Investigation Board, his voice hoarse, his hands clutching crumpled data sheets. He insisted the concept was sound. It wasn't the wing that had failed, he argued. It was the controls, the mechanical linkages, the clamshell rudders. They were too slow, too crude. They lacked the authority to counter the inherent instability. It wasn't a failure of aerodynamics, he insisted to a panel of stone-faced generals. It was a failure of mechanics. Give me time, give me resources, a proper yaw damper, a better autopilot, a faster actuating control system. I can fix this. But his pleas fell on deaf, hostile ears. The board's final report was a masterpiece of political and bureaucratic assassination, wrapped in the language of objective engineering. The cause of the crash was ruled as inherent aerodynamic instability, leading to a catastrophic departure from controlled flight. The key finding was that the YB-49, in its current tailless configuration, was fundamentally unsafe for operation by human pilots. The report was a damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of the entire all-wing philosophy. Alistair Vance, the crazy inventor, was officially ruled a failure. The political fallout was immediate and total. The YB-49, with its jet-powered speed and incredible potential range, had been a profound threat to the other, far larger, far more politically connected defense program of the day, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker. The B-36 was a monster, a lumbering 6-engine, later 10 with 4 jets tacked on, piston-driven behemoth. It was a dinosaur, a product of 1941-era thinking, slow, complex, and vulnerable. But it was conventional. It had a tail. It had powerful backers in Congress and a champion in the Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington. The B-36 program was a massive industrial enterprise employing tens of thousands across multiple states. The YB-49, in contrast, was a radical, almost boutique project, championed by one crazy inventor and his small, dedicated team. The crash gave the B-36 lobby the precise weapon it needed. They painted the YB-49 not just as a failure, but as a dangerous, fiscally irresponsible folly. Why? The senators argued in closed-door sessions. Are we wasting millions on Mr. Vance's uncontrollable science fiction kites when we have a proven, reliable, safe heavy bomber, the B-36, already in production? The argument was simple, powerful, and, in the wake of the fatal crash, unassailable. The order came down from the Air Force Chief of Staff in late 1949. The YB-49 program was to be canceled, immediately. All remaining flying wing prototypes, including the second YB-49 and the remaining propeller-driven YB-35s that were being converted, were to be destroyed. It wasn't enough to simply park them, to mothball them, to save them for future study. They were to be erased. The directive was brutal, a scorched earth policy designed to eliminate every last trace of Vance's heresy and clear the path for the B-36. The scene at the Vance aircraft facility in Burbank was a funeral. Men who had poured their lives, their passion, their very souls into building these magnificent, futuristic machines were forced to stand by and watch as the scrappers moved in. They came not with wrenches and dollies, but with acetylene torches and wrecking balls. The sound of the cutting torches, the high-pitched metallic shriek of blue-white flame slicing through the pristine black duralumin skin of the last YB-49, was a sound of violation. It was a sound that haunted Alistair Vance for the rest of his life. He stood at the edge of the tarmac, a solitary broken figure in a rumpled suit, watching as cranes ripped the engines from their mounts, as saws cut the elegant 172-foot wing into manageable transportable chunks of scrap. It was a systematic, brutal dismemberment. They were killing his dream, piece by piece, melting down a vision of the 21st century to be sold by the pound as scrap aluminum. The message was clear. This idea is dead. This idea is forbidden. For Alistair Vance, the personal cost was absolute. Vance Aircraft, having staked its entire financial future on the flying wing, was ruined. With its primary contract canceled, its reputation shattered, the company was forced into a fire sale. Its assets, its engineers, its very name swallowed up by a larger, more conventional competitor, Northrop Aircraft, a bitter irony given that company's own later history. Vance himself was finished. He was 50 years old, a pariah, the crazy inventor who had gotten good men killed, the man who had bet everything on a flying pancake and lost. He was quietly blacklisted from the mainstream aerospace industry, which was now firmly, safely, committed to the B-36 and the development of conventional, tailed, swept-wing jets like the F-86 and B-47. He retreated into an angry, self-imposed obscurity, a bitter recluse, forever sketching variations of his perfect wing on napkins, writing long, increasingly frantic letters and monographs to aviation journals, trying to prove, to anyone who would listen, that he had been right. He argued that the YB-49 hadn't failed because it was a wing. It had failed because it lacked the brain to control its own inherent instability. He wrote about electronic stability augmentation, about artificial feel, about yaw dampers, concepts that were primitive or non-existent in 1948. He was, once again, designing a future that the technology of his day could not yet support. His voice, once a powerful, if eccentric, force in aviation, was now just the rambling of a crank, a forgotten man, a tragic footnote in the grand story of the Cold War. He died in the 1970s, still convinced, still bitter. His name synonymous not with innovation, but with one of aviation's most spectacular and tragic failures. The conventional airplane, with its fuselage and tail, had won. The crazy inventor's dream was buried, not just in the Mojave Desert, but under the weight of history itself. But the data, the terabytes of priceless flight telemetry from the YB-49's successful and final flights, the wind tunnel reports from the N9M, Vance's own meticulous calculations, that was not destroyed. It was classified, boxed up, and buried deep within the archives, in a dusty, forgotten vault at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, waiting for a new generation, a new threat, and a new technology, the digital flight computer, that could finally unlock the crazy idea that Alistair Vance had seen decades too soon. The 1950s rolled in, and with them, the thunder of the new gods. The B-36 Peacemaker, the very plane whose political and industrial weight had crushed Vance's wing, dominated the sky, a lumbering, six-prop, four-jet engine statement of conventional power. It was soon followed by the sleek, all-jet B-47 Stratojet, and the ultimate expression of the fuselage and tail philosophy, the B-52 Stratofortress. This was the new reality. This was the triumph of brute force, of massive engines and conventional, stable aerodynamics. Alistair Vance's YB-49, his perfect wing, was officially relegated to the scrap heap of aviation history, a bizarre, failed experiment, a punchline in engineering circles, a cautionary tale about a crazy inventor who had flown too close to the sun, championed an idea that should never have flown. The official narrative was set in stone. The tailless flying wing was inherently, fatally, unstable. Finis. But history, and the relentless pressure of the Cold War, cared little for final verdicts. The new enemy, the Soviet Union, was not just a conventional threat. It was an electronic one. The PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Network, was becoming a vast, continent-spanning, integrated web of high-powered early warning radars, coupled with high-altitude, radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. The world changed forever on May 1, 1960, when a Soviet S-75 Dvina missile, a flying telephone pole, reached up to 70,000 feet and swatted Gary Power's invincible high-altitude U-2 spy plane out of the sky. Suddenly, altitude was no longer a sanctuary. Speed, as the B-58 Hustler program was proving, was hideously expensive, thermally stressful, and still visible on radar. The American bomber force, the core of the nuclear triad, was suddenly, terrifyingly vulnerable. The Air Force's immediate, desperate counter was to change tactics. The B-52s, designed to cruise majestically in the stratosphere, were forced down into the weeds, retasked for low-level, nap-of-the-earth penetration, screaming over treetops and canyons to hide in the ground clutter below the Soviet radar net. It was a brutal, bone-jarring, airframe-stressing mission, a temporary fix. The real solution, the one whispered in the most secret corridors of the Pentagon and at black facilities like the Skunk Works, was something far more radical. It wasn't about flying around the radar or under it. It was about becoming invisible to it. The age of low observables, or stealth, had begun. In the early 1970s, under a deeply classified DARPA program, a small team of engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works, led by Ben Rich, were tasked with this impossible challenge. They famously stumbled upon the obscure work of a Russian physicist, Pyotr Ufimtsev, whose physical theory of diffraction provided the mathematical key. Ufimtsev's equations suggested that a shape made of flat panels, or facets, could deflect radar energy in highly concentrated, predictable spikes, leaving vast areas where the object was effectively invisible. This led to the Hopeless Diamond model and, ultimately, the F-117 Nighthawk, the first true stealth fighter. But the Air Force needed more. They needed a bomber, a strategic intercontinental stealth bomber, a plane that could penetrate the heart of the Soviet Union unseen. The faceted approach of the F-117 was aerodynamically crude, a flying brick that required immense computer power just to stay airborne. For a massive long-range bomber, they needed something more efficient. They needed a shape that was both inherently low observable and aerodynamically efficient. This new, impossible problem sent a different set of engineers, this time at Northrop, the very company that had absorbed the wreckage of Vance aircraft decades earlier, digging. They were looking for a high-efficiency, high-lift, low-drag airframe, the perfect body, to wrap in new, radar-absorbent materials and faceted geometry. A young, brilliant analyst, delving deep into the government's classified archives at Wright-Patterson, searching for any data on low RCS airframe configurations, stumbled upon a set of old, dusty microfilm reels. The files were marked YB49 and N9M. They were the lost data. The analyst, steeped in modern computational fluid dynamics and radar theory, began to read, and the numbers he saw must have made his blood run cold. The wind tunnel data, the actual flight test telemetry from 1947, showed RCS measurements from the head-on aspect of the YB49 that were unbelievably low. They were orders of magnitude lower than the B-52, lower even than the B-47 or B-36. Alistair Vance, in his obsessive quest for pure aerodynamic efficiency, the elimination of the drag-inducing fuselage and tail, had, completely by accident, designed a perfectly stealthy shape. The blended wing body, the buried engines, the absence of massive vertical radar-reflecting tail fins. It was a natural stealth airframe, conceived 30 years before the term stealth was even in the common vernacular. The analyst kept digging, his excitement mounting. He found the crash report, the damning verdict, inherent aerodynamic instability. He saw the official condemnation, but then, buried deeper, he found Alistair Vance's own furious, unheeded, almost prophetic rebuttals. The letters, the monographs, the desperate pleas to the Air Force, all written from his bitter obscurity. And in them, Vance didn't just defend his wing. He identified the solution. "It's not the wing," he had screamed into the void. "It's the mechanical controls. They're too slow. It needs an electronic stability augmentation system. It needs an artificial brain to manage the instability." The analyst sat back, stunned. In 1948, Vance's electronic brain was a fantasy. A yaw damper was a primitive analog device. But in 1975, it was reality. The digital revolution had happened. The microchip, born from the Apollo program, had changed everything. Computers, now small and fast enough to fit inside an aircraft, could make the thousands of microsecond corrections per second needed to tame an unstable airframe. The concept of fly-by-wire, replacing heavy, slow mechanical linkages with electrons, was no longer a theory. It was being proven in experimental aircraft. The YB-49's fatal, unfixable, tragic flaw, its inherent instability, was, to this new generation of engineers, not a flaw at all. It was an asset. It was the key to unprecedented agility and efficiency. Vance's death trap just needed a brain. And now, finally, they could build it. The memo that analyst wrote, forwarding the rediscovered YB-49 data, landed on the desk of the head of Northrop's Advanced Systems Division, their equivalent of the Skunk Works, like a bomb. Everything changed. The crazy inventor's work, salvaged from the scrap heap of history, became the foundational blueprint for the most secret, most expensive, most technologically advanced program in history, the Advanced Technology Bomber, ATB. The ATB, which would later be known to the world as the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, was, in its very DNA, the resurrection of Alistair Vance's dream. It was a flying wing. It had no fuselage, no tail. It used advanced computer-controlled split-surface elevons, which Vance had pioneered, and a refined version of his clamshell rudders, now called beaver tails, for yaw control. And most critically, it was fundamentally unstable, tamed by a quadruple redundant digital fly-by-wire flight control system. The very electronic brain Vance had dreamed of. The system that finally made his perfect, efficient, stealthy shape flyable. Alistair Vance, the man who died in 1970s, a broken, forgotten, failed inventor, had, from the grave, just handed America its next, decisive strategic weapon. His crazy design, the one that should never have flown, was about to be reborn, a black, terrifying, multi-billion-dollar ghost, the physical embodiment of his final posthumous vindication. The memo from the young Northrop analyst, the one who had unearthed the YB-49's lost data from the archives at Wright-Patterson, landed on the desks of Northrop's leadership. Men like John Cashin and the visionary head of the Advanced Systems Division, John Pachier. It landed with the quiet, devastating force of a revelation. Here, buried in the files of their own, long-absorbed, defunct competitor, was the solution. It was a ghost, reaching across 3 decades of history, offering the key to the most important military contract of the 20th century. The Advanced Technology Bomber, ATB program, the blackest of black projects, codenamed Senior Ice, was underway, and the Air Force was demanding the impossible, an intercontinental bomber that was, for all practical purposes, invisible to the entire continent-spanning Soviet air defense network. The faceted approach of the F-117, while a groundbreaking success, was an aerodynamic brute. Its flying brick nature, dictated by the limitations of 1970s-era computers in calculating radar returns, resulted in a plane that was fast, but not particularly efficient, and certainly not capable of the massive range and payload the Air Force required for a strategic bomber. They needed something better. They needed a shape that was both inherently low observable and aerodynamically slippery, a high-lift, low-drag design that could fly 10,000 miles with a heavy bomb load. And Alistair Vance's crazy flying wing, his perfect airplane, was exactly that. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. At Northrop, the very company that had swallowed Vance aircraft whole, a new, secret generation of wingnuts was born. Vance's dusty, forgotten calculations, his wind tunnel data, his furious, prophetic, rejected letters. They became the foundational gospel for the ATB program. His name, the name of the failed inventor, was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the windowless, classified vaults of the Black Design facility. They weren't just inspired by his work, they were resurrecting it. They embraced his all-wing philosophy, not as a risk, but as the only solution. The B-2 Spirit was born, a direct, spiritual, and aerodynamic descendant of the YB-49. The 172-foot wingspan, it was almost identical to the YB-49's. The broad, tailless chevron platform, it was Vance's shape, refined by supercomputers he could only have dreamed of. The control system, that was the final, triumphant vindication. Vance's great, unsolved, fatal problem, the inherent instability that had killed Bud Edwards and his crew, was now, thanks to the microchip, the B-2's greatest strength. The Northrop engineers intentionally designed the B-2 to be profoundly, fundamentally unstable, a plane that, like the YB-49, wanted to tumble out of the sky, an aircraft that no human, unassisted, could ever hope to fly. They had finally built Alistair Vance's death trap. But they also built the electronic brain he had predicted. Where Vance had crude, slow, mechanical clamshell rudders, the B-2 had a quadruple redundant, digital fly-by-wire flight control system, a silicon brain of such complexity and speed that it functioned as a virtual tail. This system took the pilot's simple inputs from the control stick and fed them into a series of algorithms that thousands of times per second calculated the precise, subtle adjustments needed across the wing's multiple complex elevon and deceleron, a direct descendant of Vance's split-surface rudders, control surfaces. It was a system that didn't just fight the instability. It used it. It allowed the B-2 to be both incredibly stable on its long, high-altitude cruise and surprisingly agile, all while maintaining the absolute bare minimum of drag-inducing control surface movements. The fatal flaw of 1948 had become the key to revolutionary performance in 1980. Vance had been right. He had been right about everything. He just didn't have the tools to prove it. He had designed a 21st century aircraft using 1940s technology. His crazy idea hadn't been wrong. It had just been early. On November 22, 1988, the United States Air Force rolled the B-2 Spirit out of its black hangar at Palmdale, California, for the first time. The world was stunned. The press, the public, even aviation experts gasped. It was alien. A black, menacing, seamless boomerang, utterly silent, looking less like an airplane and more like a rip in the sky. It was hailed as a triumph of 1980 supercomputer-aided design, a brand new revolutionary concept. But a few old men, scattered across the country, the surviving gray-haired members of Vance's original wingnut team, watched the footage on their televisions, and they wept. They didn't see a new plane. They saw a ghost. They saw their beautiful black YB-49, finally returned from its fiery grave, finally perfected, finally understood. The world saw the future. They saw the past, redeemed. Alistair Vance, the crazy inventor, had died in the 1970s, a bitter, obscure, forgotten man, convinced his life's work had been a tragic failure. He never saw the B-2. He never knew that his dream, his perfect airplane, would become the most dominant, most feared, and most strategically important aircraft on the planet. He never knew that his unflyable design would become the pinnacle of American air power, a $2 billion per-copy testament to his crazy vision. His name is not on the B-2. He is not celebrated in the press releases. But his genius is in every line, every curve, every silent, invisible, terrifying inch of that black wing. He was the man who designed a warplane that should never have flown. And in doing so, he designed the one warplane that, decades later, could not be stopped. His vindication, like his aircraft, is silent, total, and absolute.